HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Book of Esther, a novel, by Emily Barton. Read by Rebecca Gibel. And in every province and in every city whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had gladness and joy, a feast and a good day. And many from among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews was fallen upon them. Esther, chapter 8, verse 17. JPS Tanakh. Chapter 1. Dim pricks of blue light shone through the shutter's decorative punchwork. Careful not to wake her sister, Esther braced her hand against one door while she drew back the other. The wooden panel stuck a moment before popping free, letting in the damp, salty air and a view of purplish sky. To the east, the sun cast its first pink glow over the place where the mighty river Atil spilled into the Khazar Sea. Esther raced through her morning prayers, her voice a sibilant whisper. From her father's house, high up in the walled city of Atil, Esther could see sailors on the island-sized expanse of an aerocraft carrier's deck. Some worked with mops and pails, some checked the serried rows of flying machines. One hoisted the cagnate's white flag, which hung limp in the still air as it jerked up its pole. The decks of the Khazar warships bustled with activity. Men also worked aboard great Ottoman and Persian merchant ships, moored across the river in Atil's twin city of Khazaran. Fishing boats plied the water. Downstairs, someone dropped a log and swore to her native god. The smell of fresh flatbread rose from the kitchen. Much of the world was at work at this hour, just not the children of the Bek's Kender, or chief policy advisor Josephus. Esther's sister Elisheva still slept, her mouth open, her dark hair trailing onto Esther's pillow. Esther slipped out of her nightgown, pulled on the sweater and loose trousers she'd worn the day before, and walked barefoot into the cold hallway and down the stairs. Her boots, like everyone's, waited by the back door. On her way through the kitchen, Esther filched a flatbread the older kitchen maid, Afra, had just pulled from the oven. The younger maid, Kiraz, looked up teary-eyed from chopping onions but didn't say anything. Holding the hot bread between 3 fingertips, Esther scooped into the pot of warm lentils over the fire. Afra began to complain. It had been her swearing a moment earlier, and Esther gestured an apology and said, I'm sorry, I'll clean it up." But she was already at the door, the bread and lentils folded into one hand while she wrestled on her fur-lined boots with the other. When she'd taken them off the night before, they'd been caked with red mud. Someone had brushed them clean. She had nearly crossed the inner courtyard before Itak zoomed up beside her, hopping to pull on his second shoe. He carried a rucksack on his back. Mindful not to hit it or knock the Bukhari kippah off the back of his head, Esther put her free arm around his small shoulder. The top of his head reached her armpit. Itak took the opportunity to grab the dripping bread and lentils. He took a big, sloppy bite before returning it to her. "Disgusting," Esther said without meaning it. "You didn't even bless it." He was only about 9 years old, but should have known better. He sang out a quick motzi and wiped his mouth on his forearm. "Good morning to you, too," she said. Then she tore the bread in half. They kept walking, companionably quiet while they ate. The sharp, dry turmeric in the lentils cleared Esther's nose. Lentil juice plopped onto the ground. At the far end of the inner courtyard, the gate stood shut, held fast by a wire loop. Esther swung this up, then drew the gate open, careful to lift as she did so to prevent the hinges from squeaking. Itak ran through and she closed it again behind them. A higher brick wall surrounded the house's outer courtyard to protect the whole enclosure from attack. Nestled beneath it were the 3 small servants' houses, empty at this hour, as the staff was up working. The storehouse, the barn, whose milk goats and irritable chickens were already out cropping and pecking at the grass, and Esther's destination, the mechanical stable. As she strode toward it, Itak ducked off toward the compound's pigeon loft. "It's late, we have to hurry," Esther said. Not bothering to look back, Etok made a gesture of dismissal behind him. Most of the birds belonged to Josephus and a few to foreign governments, who used them to carry intelligence. But Etok had a passion for them. He kept and trained some of his own, and cared for the whole loft with Esther's brother, Shmuel. The birds strutted and cooed, excited at his approach. Esther heard the rain-like pitter of scattering feed. The mechanical stable was as old as any building in the compound. In Esther's grandfather's time, it had housed the strong-boned natural horses one now mainly saw speckling the countryside, their flanks a pleasing motley of browns and grays. Esther had learned to ride one before mastering their mechanical kin. In her father's young manhood, Khazaria had invented the mechanical horse, a war machine to protect the rough-terrained homeland from the Rus to the east, the Ottomanim to the south, and oil-hungry Europa to the west. The machines had stood guard as the conflict that brought down the Austro-Magyar Empire rolled across the steppe to Khazaria's western border. But the kaganate had not been of interest. A few skirmishes and the chief combatants had moved on to fight with one another. In the intervening 20 years, engineers kept improving the horses, which constituted Khazaria's chief defense in the event of a land war. Early models had been big and clumsy as steer, with shift mechanisms so awkwardly placed and requiring such force to operate, people called them suicide shifters. The most recent model was smaller and faster, more aerodynamic, with the shifter incorporated more safely into the left handlebar. The unpredictable terrain of the steppe had for thousands of years favored the skilled, ruthless warrior, the man who could keep his horse while slicing off an enemy's head with his broadsword. A Khazar mounted on a mechanical horse could fight with his ancestors' brutality. The army's few hundred tanks, purchased from the Rus, were rumored to break down as often as they ran. As Esther entered her father's stable, she knew that most of her country's thousands of mech horses stood ready on the eastern bank of the Dnipro to fight the enemy barreling across Ukraine. She knew the Bek had stationed warships in all of Khazaria's seas and her many rivers. But Josephus ben Malachai's horses remained in his compound, 4 late model and 1 hulking old-fashioned mare called Layla. Selim was the one Esther drove. She liked the horse's idiosyncrasies, the way she might buck an unskilled rider, her general dark temper. The stable's pungent petroleum smell filled Esther's nose. Though she and Etok had to hurry before her father noticed them missing, she took a moment to breathe in. Batar, the stable hand, was feeding one machine a bucket of petrol. He lifted his chin in greeting. Esther touched Selim's steel muzzle, although the machine could not respond unless she was running. Esther patted her side. A dull, muffled sound emerged.
"She's fueled,"
Batar said.
"Ready to go." "Yemeez?"
Esther spoke enough Turk to nod and thank him. Batar put down his funnel and bucket, took a grimy chamois from his pocket, and gave a cursory swipe at Selim's integrated saddle and stirrups. Steppe warriors could ride bareback when necessary, but a mechanical horse's controls were all in its tack. The shift, throttle, and front brake resided in the handlebars that protruded from behind the ears, the rear brake in the right stirrup, the starter behind it. Esther climbed up and over, hooking her left foot tight to get a good jump on the starter. It took a couple of tries to make the engine turn over. Batar opened up the choke for her. It was a far reach for a person of her size. As she settled onto the rumbling machine, she felt the pattern of Selim's riveting rub against the inner seam of her pants. She revved Selim's engine, shifted her into reverse, and prodded her with one foot as she eased out the clutch with her left hand to encourage her toward the open stable door. "We'll be back shortly," she said, leaning down so Batar could hear her over the engine. "Tesyakura derim." Her thanks. Etok came running toward the stable with one hand cupped over a small bulge in his shirt. One-handed and without even a foothold, he clambered up behind her and mounted the back of the saddle. Though mechanical horses had no provision for a passenger, he was small enough to ride pillion behind her. He wrapped one arm around her waist and held tight. The other must still have been cradling the bird she felt adjusting its position against her back. "What are you doing?" she asked him. "I promised Yasha." Irritated, she jerked her braid free of him. Dawn had already broken. The bird struggled before seeming to settle in against its master. Salim was not built for a casual stroll. She had a 150cc engine and a foul temper, never a lucky combination in a horse. But to the extent that she was capable of feeling anything, she grudgingly liked Esther, the person who drove her most often, and didn't seem to mind Itak's negligible excess weight. So she walked almost docilely toward the outer courtyard wall in first gear. The guard said,
"Salam alaikum,"
pulled the wooden latch and opened the gate. Esther said, "Alaikum shalom," and rolled the shifter forward to click up into second, the lower trotting gear. She heard the gate shut behind them and the drumroll of aeroplane engines turning over on the carriers in the river. Preparing for their daily exercises, she thought. Further proof she and Itak had gotten a late start. Salim's hooves rang against the cobbled street as stuccoed house fronts, slate roofs, and brightly painted window boxes blurred past. Past the river and the bridge stretched Khazaran's covered market, onion domes, and the spire of the Nazarene worship house. Moments later, Esther and Itak saluted a guard at the city's great north gate and passed through. He shouted something after them, but they hurried on without hearing. Once Esther shifted the horse up into third, the faster trot, she was in her element. She let her feet dangle in the stirrups, unafraid of where the chugging machine would go. The exhaust vents in the belly blew warm air against her cold legs. When high-born Khazar men practiced horsemanship, they raced to get the horses up to third. Then, though the right hand held steady on the throttle, the left could fire a pistol or wield a sword. Esther looked over her shoulder to ask, "What did you get?" "Yesterday's bread, a few other things. I could have done better." A moment passed before he added, "I did remember the bird." Bat-winged KAF aerocraft took off westward. Esther pictured the river-crossed steppe they flew toward, all the terrain they would cover before they reached Ukraine and the enemy troops. She turned her mind back to guiding the horse. Salim would have liked to gallop off toward the fields and grasslands, but knew the routine. Esther kept her hands firm on the handlebars, and she headed up the riverbank toward the camp. One couldn't see it from Josephus ben Malachi's house, or from any wealthy dwelling in the city. When the great, hidden Khagan had ordered the Bek to give permission for a second camp near the capital, he had mandated its invisibility. Though the Khagan never left the enclosure of his palace, he did not wish to see this camp any more than he did the one that sprawled along the banks of the Dnipro in the west. Most people Esther knew agreed with him. Among girls of Esther's station, there had been a fad the previous winter of knitting for the refugees. Not one girl had gone to present her goat's hair hat or mittens to an actual displaced person. Servants had done it for them. Esther sometimes glimpsed Shimon ben Kalanimus in the settlement performing some act of tzedakah or chesed, charity or loving-kindness. Once she had overheard him talking to a man about irrigating his meager garden plot. As far as she knew, the two of them were alone in this predilection among people of their rank. To reach the camp, one continued beyond the port and wound around a wooded hill that concealed a bend in the Atil River. Then the camp opened up to view, a flat, haphazard sprawl as large and crowded as the city itself. Unlike any Khazar city or town, its outermost dwellings stood open to view, vulnerable to attack. There had been no time to build a defensive wall, no great interest in doing it. Immigrant women by the hundreds were already out drawing river water for cooking. Others slapped wet clothes against the rocks. Many wore old-fashioned Western-style dresses, though some were in Khazar cast-offs, others in rags, and nearly all covered their pale or reddish hair with kerchiefs. Esther knew it was impolite to stare, but she was fascinated by their coloring, their uniformly fair skin. Khazars did not even all practice the same religion, and those who were Jews had not descended from a single clan. Under Kagan Bulan, more than 1,000 years before, the nation of Turkic tribes had converted in a grand public ceremony. Their ethnic stock was mixed, colorful. Intellectually, Esther understood the refugees' common heritage, yet she still puzzled over it. At that moment, watching the washerwomen in the morning light, their foreignness struck her anew. Some of the women glanced up from their work when they heard Salim's engine gutter as she slowed. Most remained intent on their labor. Ruchel alone stood up. Her lips pressed into a straight line as she gave a final ring to a heavy brown twist of fabric. She tossed it into one of the reed baskets at her feet, wiped her chapped hands on her dirty apron, and came toward the horse. "Good morgen," she said, pushing an orange curl back under the headscarf. When she smiled, her face looked drawn and tired. Esther left the horse idling in neutral and jumped down. "Good morgen." Two nearby women looked at her again. Esther wasn't sure if they were surprised to hear a Khazar attempting to speak their language or offended by her pronunciation. "Nice to see you." Still cradling the pigeon in his shirt, Itak brought one leg across the horse to sit side saddle, then slid down. "Wo ist Yasha?" he asked. At that moment, Ruchel's son came running up, shouting, "Itak, did you bring her?" "This is Nagehan," he said, and from his shirt produced what looked to Esther like just another messenger pigeon, a repurposed bullet casing strapped to its back. Yasha murmured a syllable of approval, which made Esther look at it more closely. The bird blinked, tilted its head to one side. On second glance, it wasn't a typical gray or brown pigeon. It was white, with delicate gray spotting on its wings and tail. Its eyes were red, but she thought all pigeons might have red eyes. She seldom paid them much mind, though she did admire the cunning fabrication of the message cases, their tiny straps. Yasha and Itak bent their heads, one light, one dark, together to examine the bird and talk over her attributes. Like other boys in the camp, Yasha wore a loose-fitting cloth cap with a brim, different from the cruel work pillbox Itak and other Khazar Jews wore. The single gold earring of Itak's servitude glinted beneath his unkempt hair. Esther flicked a finger at his rucksack. "Can you take this off?" Itak shrugged one arm out, then transferred the bird to his free arm to do the other. He held the bag in Esther's direction and went back to talking with Yasha. "Let's see what he got for you." Esther crouched down to unbuckle the straps and her braid slipped forward over her shoulder. She wondered if wearing a Khazar woman's workday trousers and with her braid visible, she looked indecent to these covered women. She pulled out a pile of day-old flatbreads and handed them to Ruchel, who cleared a space in one of her baskets. Esther opened a heavy cloth bag to see what was inside, then gave it to Ruchel, saying, "Lentils." When she handed over 3 onions, Ruchel remarked on them. "Ach, gut. Zwiebeln." Some of their papery brown skin fluttered off toward the river. "Is that all?" Esther called up to Itak. "Kiraz came in. I couldn't get more." Esther shook her head.
"Don't be angry with him,"
Ruchel said.
"It's an act of chesed."
To Itak, she nodded and said,
"Adank."
"We'll try again tomorrow," Esther said. Other women observed their transaction. Esther couldn't read their expressions, but imagined them as hostile. When she looked around, she saw how far into the northern distance the camp's densely packed hovels spread. A stream of aerocraft continued to head westward from the port. Itak held the pigeon up in both hands, then flung her toward the sky. She wobbled as she climbed, then began flying in tight, fast circles overhead. Both boys looked up delighted, and Yasha shouted, "In Toib! Gain!" to encourage her. He was an awkward boy, hands and feet too long for the rest of his body. His interest in the bird lent him a sudden grace. A puddle seeped from under the basket of clean laundry. In Esther's father's house, the laundress used a hand-cranked machine to do the wash and a mangle to help dry it. Still, it took her all day. Though Ruchel would soon have to get back to work, she said,
"What's the news? Has your father planned your wedding?"
Without looking at them, Itak replied for her.
"After Simchat Torah."
"Shut up," Esther said. Yasha had taught Itak some colorful swears in his native language, which was full of them, and Itak had passed them on. She couldn't repeat them here.
"Why do you tell him this?" Ruchel asked. "How old are you?"
16.
This might not have been the answer Ruchel expected. Her face softened as she drew in a breath, approving.
"I too married at your age."
Esther had never bothered to wonder how old Ruchel was. She now took in the lines in her friend's face, the irritated skin of her hands. How old was Yasha? 8 or 9, which put Ruchel in her mid-20s. She looked older. Esther and her sister prided themselves on their smooth olive skin and the dark hair that had never been cut. She realized she wouldn't have had either of these had her life been as hard as Ruchel's.
"What are you thinking?"
Ruchel asked. Esther shook her head.
"The chief rabbi's son. Be happy."
"I am,"
she said, though she couldn't conform her face to the expression people like to see on a happy bride.
"What flowers bloom at Sukkot?"
Though she pronounced the word strangely, Esther understood.
"I'll braid them in your pretty hair."
Nothing flowered in the month of Tishri. Winter would blow across the steppe by then. Regardless of the expense, her father would import silk facsimiles of orange blossoms from Persia for her hair. If Khazaria's enemies had not breached their borders by then, if merchant ships still sailed free in international waters. She felt a sudden shame at her family's decadence and told none of this to her friend. Ruchel went on.
"I'd like to help you prepare. A married woman's duty."
"I'd like that too."
Esther would have liked to invite Ruchel to the wedding and the 7 blessings, but Esther had had so little to do with choosing Shimon ben Kalanimus, she doubted she'd be allowed to choose her guests. "A suitable boy from a good family," her father had said. "And you like him, yes?" Yes, she did like him. Very much. She had known Shimon since childhood. He was smart and good-hearted. She would enjoy wearing her mother's scarlet and saffron wedding robe. What confused Esther was that today she was some unnamed thing between a girl and a woman, out riding a purloined mechanical horse. In a few months, she'd be Shimon's wife, living in his father's house, bearing his children. Someday she'd be the Rebbitzin of Atil. Esther had been raised to expect something like this, but the potential transformation mystified her. And no one had mentioned Itak, who stood before her now giving exuberant hand signals to his bird. She didn't want to go to Kalanimus's house unless Itak was part of the retinue. Retinue, she thought. A reminder that however dear Itak was to her, he was her father's slave, having relinquished his nominal freedom at the Jubilee. However long her mind had wandered, Esther was drawn back to the present by an odd jerk in Salim's head. The horse looked up, then began the rapid, ratcheting head motion mechanical horses made while closing in on a target. The ball joint in her neck ticked. She was tracking something in the sky. Esther looked up but saw only Itak's pigeon circling, and behind it sparse clouds like tufts of carded wool. Then the pigeon darted off to the east, toward Khazaran. Itak shaded his eyes with his hand and peered westward.
"I've got it,"
he said. By now, a faint hum, as of a far-off swarm of locusts, approached from beyond the harvest plain. The washerwomen ceased their work, and the girls minding the littlest children began sticking their heads out from their tents and huts. Esther couldn't make out what Itak had seen.
"It's an aeroplane,"
he said, but kept scanning the sky.
"It's 3 of them, flying in a V like geese. More than 3.
Esther could now make them out, dark specks in the bright morning.
By Hashem and the Shekhinah,
his holy consort.
It's a flock of them.
Their engines whined. Khazar aerocraft had lower-pitched voices. Esther said, "Not ours." Itak peered at them as they came closer.
The wings are strange.
Ruchel translated for the women, whose children gathered around clinging to their mothers' skirts and legs. The aeroplanes grew louder by the moment as they multiplied in the western sky. There were more than 20 of them, flying in a phalanx, exactly like geese, except that geese didn't emit an ominous mechanical thrum. By now they were loud enough to have drawn men from their labors and the house of study, all the boys from their books in the cheder, their forelocks swinging while they ran. As the aeroplanes barreled toward the capital, their details sprang into view. Each was small, manned by a single airman. Unlike Khazar aerocraft, each had only one set of wings, low on the machine and pointing back toward the tail, like a swallow's. Esther couldn't imagine how they remained aloft. They looked to be sheathed in metal. On its side, each bore a foreign emblem, a bright white circle on a vermilion field, in its center a skewed Byzantine cross. In the moment, Esther couldn't place it, but all around her people were shouting. Itak looked at her and said,
"It's them. They're here."
And at once, she recognized the flag. The enemy. The kaganate whose leader's name no one spoke. Their symbol of rebirth. Were these aeroplanes bombers? If so, it was too late to hide. As the aeroplanes came closer, they turned their noses toward the ground in unison, but leveled off again to keep from crashing into the houses of the court up on the hill. Some of the refugees, meanwhile, had sprinted for cover, while others prayed in the eerie rocking motion they fell into when addressing Hashem. Some were shouting to one another to be heard over the roar of the engines, while others shouted and gestured at the aeroplanes. Esther recognized a few of the curses. Boys hurled rocks. Selim, lusting for blood, reared on her hind legs, her sturdy forelegs kicking in the air, her bright green eyes, made from the same marbles children shot in the alleyways, scanning furiously. The aeroplanes were now so close Esther could smell their exhaust. Each had a sort of nipple in its nose, a machine gun, and some kind of bombing apparatus yoked to the undersides of the wings. She could see the pilots, their faces hidden behind goggles and leather helmets. Some held onto the steering yokes one-handed, the other hand holding the kind of box camera girls like Esther took on vacation. They were snapping pictures of the port and the refugee camp. She kept waiting for their armaments to fire, but nothing exploded, nothing dropped. If the refugees kept weapons in this camp, these would be knives or shotguns for hunting, powerless against an aerial assault. The carriers in the river had to have anti-aerocraft missiles trained on these targets, but the enemy aeroplanes would have to get closer for them to fire. When the aeroplanes flew out over the waters of the Khazar Sea, they banked and turned, and in formation headed back the way they'd come, a battery of fire chasing their tails. Esther braced herself for bombs to drop, but as the machines passed over the refugee camp, rustling the women's headscarves and the men's tzitzit in their stinking wake, they gained altitude. By the time they headed off toward the Pontus, they were high enough to resemble birds again. A moment later, a squadron of Khazar aeroplanes raced westward in pursuit. These wooden-bodied aerocraft had the distinctive double wings of all Khazar flying machines, and bore on their sides the kagnate's emblem, a blue 8-branched menorah crossed on the diagonal by a golden sword. Scores of them flew past, perhaps all that remained aboard the aerocraft carriers she'd seen earlier. To Esther's eye, they appeared to move more slowly than the enemy aeroplanes, but handy as she was with Selim, she was no expert on flying machines. The percussive patter of their guns began, the sound like that of mustard seeds popping in a skillet of hot oil. Far to the west, 2 enemy machines were hit at once. They whistled as if in amazement, as followed by their own twisting contrails they plummeted. When they hit the ground, they rumbled like thunder.
Sample complete.
Ready to continue?